motto of our lab is understand the science of your happiness, right? And the reason I say that is because there's only one you, right? There's only one you, there's only one me in the history of the universe and in the future of the universe. Only one of us, right? That's like mind boggling because the chances of us existing are so small to begin with. And so you're here for a reason, right? I'm here for a reason. And, for me, my anhedonia wasn't related to any substances, but someone else's anhedonia may be related to that. Mine was due to just not being present, not allowing myself the time and space to savor and to really honor what's important to me. And because I was so focused on, I can't run out of resources because of my own personal history of scarcity trauma, I was missing out on the simple joys in life, the simple pleasures, which for me are connection, being with the people I love the most, because I was so worried about running out. And that was the source of my overworking. But for someone else, it could be something different. It could be maybe a past parental like abuse or neglect, right? Where you were taught that you were unlovable and you kept that inside and never processed it. So your whole identity is tied to your role and you're doing for others, you're doing for your workplace. So you never slow it out. And because maybe that is something that is related to someone who's dissonant. So that's why it's important to try to understand the science of your happiness. There's only one you, right? There'll only ever be one you. So really take the time to understand, where are you losing your joy in your life? Because we often think, oh, I have to try this, I have to read this book, I have to listen to that podcast to be happy. But we're not even reflecting on where are we actually losing the joy that we have in our own personal lives. Then we can strategically add back that joy.
Okay, Dr. Judith, welcome to the show. To get started, what is high functioning depression?
Well, thanks for having me. High function depression is not yet recognized by the medical literature. What is recognized is major depressive disorder or clinical depression. So essentially, people have symptoms of depression, such as low mood, poor concentration, low energy, anhedonia, which is a lack of joy, pleasure, and interest in things. All of these symptoms. And then at the bottom of that checklist, according to the ICD-11 and DSM-5, you have to boost functioning or you have to be in distress. Now, there are a lot of people who have symptoms of depression, but they don't necessarily check those final two boxes of losing functioning or being in distress. So what are they told? They're told, well, come back when you finally break down. And I thought, well, why are we doing that? Why are we waiting for people to break down? Let's educate people about how to recognize these signs, how to prevent a breakdown, how to prevent a crisis. And then, we can lead people to reclaiming their joy, right? And that's how I decided to study high function depression. Those individuals with all these symptoms, but they don't break down. They actually overwork, they overfunction. They're human doings, not human beings.
Have you found any particular groups that are most at risk of suffering from this, like entrepreneurs, neurodivergent populations, anybody in particular?
Well, the only peer-reviewed published study of high functioning depression in the world was the one that I published earlier this year. So we need more studies looking at that. But I could talk about what I see in clinical practice. What the study showed was that people who tend to be caregivers tend to have high rates of anhedonia. People who have past trauma, which is really interesting because when you think about it, with trauma, you often think of, okay, you don't want to be triggered by people, situations, places. So you avoid going to them. So you may stay home and shut down. But what we found was that these individuals were likely coping with their trauma by not shying away or hiding away, but by overworking. And that was their way of distracting. That was their way of avoiding processing it by busying themselves. And, you know, in my clinical practice, what I've seen is that a lot of folks who tend to, have a lot on their plate, like taking care of small children or taking care of the elderly parents, being caregivers, also Those who've had, let's say, past financial trauma, right? They're entrepreneurs. Maybe they've lost a lot of money in the past, or maybe they've had run out of resources. They never want to be there again. So even though they're struggling with a lack of joy, even though they're struggling with these symptoms of depression, they don't shut down because they never want to be in a position of lacking resources again. So those are things that I've seen healthcare professionals, if you're in a culture of work where, you're taught your pain doesn't really take priority, your patients take priority. So you don't share what you're going through. You wear this mask of pathological productivity. On the outside, you look put together. No one knows you're struggling inside because maybe the culture of your work is to not talk about feelings. So, these are just some of the types of patients I've seen over the years who fit that profile of high function depression, right? They can't afford to break down. They can't afford to, they're struggling. So they don't. They wear that mask of pathological productivity. Those are the ones who are humans doing, not human beings.
So interesting. So it's almost like these people don't feel safe enough to slow down. So their nervous system is constantly in that sort of like highly switched on state, and they've no rest and recovery, no downtime, no savoring. It's just go, go, go.
Yeah, I love that you brought the nervous system because when you think of fight or flight, you think of hypervigilance, you think of nightmares, you think of your heart racing. But another form of a fight or flight is it can't sit still. When you sit still and you're not working, you feel empty, you feel restless. So you've got to busy yourself to fill up that space. You don't want to sit still enough to process what's going on. And it may not even be on a conscious level, it's probably an unconscious level. And I'm often asked, well, how is that different than burnout, right? Well, and I have this brain next to me that I usually show patients. Burnout, think about burnout. It's an occupational hazard. It was only entered into the medical literature maybe 30, 40 years ago. But by definition, the burnt out brain in the workplace, you have all the stressors from the workplace, and you have these symptoms of low motivation, irritability, low energy. When you remove that brain or that person from the workplace, those stressors aren't there, so they get better over time, right? That's burnout, right? The occupational hazard. So the burnt out brain in the workplace has all the stressors, and and that brain has all these symptoms. Same like low motivation, low energy, anhedonia. But then you bring that brain out of the workplace, they still aren't better, right? The stresses are gone, but the symptoms are still there. They still can't sit still. They still can't relax. There's still anhedonia. Why? Because it's not the external causing it. It's the internal. There's something unresolved inside that hasn't been processed. So that's why when they sit still, they feel empty. When they're not working, they feel restless. They're in that fight or flight. And so that's very helpful for people to understand because burnout was such like a popular thing for the past couple of years. People talk about burnout, this burnout. But I think a lot of us aren't necessarily just burned out. A lot of us are depressed. We have high function depression, but burnout is a more socially accepted or acceptable concept, right? You go to a work party and you're like, oh, I'm so burnt out. People are like, me too, me three. You go to a work party, you say, I'm so depressed. People are like, it's like crickets, like nobody wants to talk about that. They're like, look at you like you're weird, right? So that's the difference between burnout.
That's a really important distinction to make. And for someone listening to this, thinks, "Oh, this could be me." How can someone tell if they have high functioning depression? Like, what would the inner experience be of somebody who has this?
Yeah, we usually, if you're at work and if your work is caregiving, right? You're someone that stays at home, whatever your work is, and you're doing it, and maybe you're really very productive, but you're still enjoying it. You're still experiencing pleasure and interest. That's different, right? That's great. Good for you. More power to you. But you're someone who has, these symptoms of depression, but you can't slow down. You're not breaking down. And you're not really enjoying things. You're like eating your food and you're like, you're watching your favorite show, but you have to rewind it because you're not even present. Even being around others that used to light you up and you're just like dreading it. Like all those simple joys in life, they're just not giving you that same pleasure and interest. That's a hallmark, right? If you're experiencing that anhedonia, but you haven't broken down, you're still productive, don't ignore that. Your doctor may say, oh, come back when you break down, but you should know that, you know, the ability to experience joy, that is built into our DNA. It's encoded in our DNA to have pleasure in things. So if you're not getting pleasure and joy out of simple things in life, that is a red flag. And the joy is our birthright as humans. No matter where we come from, no matter what we look like, human beings, our birthright is joy. So if you can't claim that joy, or if it feels out of reach for you, that is problematic.
Joy is our birthright as human beings. I love that. And what's the link you mentioned with trauma? Would there be much comorbidity here with addiction? This seems like it would parallel quite significantly with something like addiction. Have you found that in your research or in your lab or in your practice?
Yes, actually, anhedonia is a scientific term that's been around for about 200 years. And a lot of the anhedonia research, right, that lack of joy, it's done in substance abuse, actually, and substance dependence and substance related conditions, depending on how you want to classify it. So a lot of people don't like the word abuse, but substance related conditions, anhedonia is highly prominent because if you think about it, substance related conditions are closely tied to the pleasure and the reward centers in the brain. And when your brain has changed to view rewards differently because of substances, you may no longer enjoy things in general. Anhedonia is something a lot of people who are in recovery will say, I experienced that. I just didn't know there was a term for that. And a lot of the work in recovery from substances has to do with retraining your brain to engage in and enjoy the simple pleasures in life again. Because, for so many years, this brain that was accustomed to deriving joy and pleasure from a substance, an external substance that has completely rewired their reward pathways. If that's been your brain for years and you no longer have that substance there, right? And your brain is rewired to view pleasure differently. Anhedonia is a prominent challenge for a lot of brains in recovery from substances. And that's why a lot of the research was in that area. There's also a lot of research with anhedonia, not just in depression, but in trauma, because if your brain is constantly triggered in fight or flight, I don't know very many stressed out people who are able to be joyful at the same time. That brain is so stressed. And also, there's a lot of anhedonia work in fields of psychosis, like schizophrenia. Schizophrenia is a psychotic condition where people often lose sight of reality. They experience things that are called positive symptoms, which is a little misleading. The word positive sounds good, but it's not. Positive symptoms, just think plus bar. You have these symptoms of like hallucinations, delusions, illusions. Um, the negative symptoms of schizophrenia are like the negative mark, like losing affect. So you kind of talk like that, or having depression and having anhedonia, lots of pleasure and interest. The negative symptoms of schizophrenia are things like not being able to think clearly. So a lot of the words are jumbled up, right? So there are many different uh, conditions where people experience anhedonia, not just depression. And that's why I think people get a bit confused because they're like, "Oh, that sounds like me." You know, people who are neurodivergent, a lot of people with ADHD have co-occurring depression, anxiety, and ADHD. While anhedonia is not a symptom of ADHD, it is a symptom of depression. And so, because there's an overlap, there's comorbidity or co-occurrence of depression and ADHD, a lot of my neurodivergent clients say, "I have anhedonia too."
So interesting. What you were saying about addiction reminded me of a quote I heard from Andrew Huberman a few years ago. It was something along the lines of addiction is a progressive narrowing of what you can get pleasure from. And then on the flip side of that, recovery is essentially a gradual process of expanding what you get pleasure from. And I've heard you speak a lot about the importance of being able to savor. And I know you've been on a bit of a journey yourself. You were giving a talk in 2020, and you suddenly realized, oh my God, am I depressed? So something I was curious to ask you is, how did you how did you develop or cultivate the ability to savor in your life? How have you practiced that?
Yeah, it's interesting because I often say the term that the motto of our lab is understand the science of your happiness, right? And the reason I say that is because there's only one you, right? There's only one you, there's only one me in the history of the universe and in the future of the universe. Only one of us, right? That's like mind boggling because the chances of us existing are so small to begin with. And so you're here for a reason, right? I'm here for a reason. And, for me, my anhedonia wasn't related to any substances, but someone else's anhedonia may be related to that. Mine was due to just not being present, not allowing myself the time and space to savor and to really honor what's important to me. And because I was so focused on, I can't run out of resources because of my own personal history of scarcity trauma, I was missing out on the simple joys in life, the simple pleasures, which for me are connection, being with people I love the most, because I was so worried about running out. And that was the source of my overworking. But for someone else, it could be something different. It could be maybe a past parental like abuse or neglect, right? Where you were taught that you were unlovable and you kept that inside and never processed it. So your whole identity is tied to your role and you're doing for others, you're doing for your workplace. So you never slow it out. And because maybe that is something that is related to someone who's dissonant. So that's why it's important to try to understand the science of your happiness. There's only one you, right? There'll only ever be one you. So really take the time to understand, where are you losing your joy in your life? Because we often think, oh, I have to try this, I have to read this book, I have to listen to that podcast to be happy. But we're not even reflecting on where are we actually losing the joy that we have in our own personal lives. Then we can strategically add back that joy.
I love that. I love that. And something else, just on this idea of the science of your happiness, something else that I've heard you speak about that I think is just so important is the biopsychosocial lens on all of this, and really understanding your own biopsychosocial blueprint. Can you maybe just share with our listeners a bit about this and why this is so important?
Yeah. So the biopsychosocial model is a model that's usually taught to medical students and health professionals early in our education. And many times we'll see a patient, like I saw patients this morning, and type up like this full assessments. And, you give the assessment to the patient, they read it, and there's a section called the biopsychosocial. Well, I can tell you, I don't know how many patients have not read that, right? They don't read it. They're just like, they skip down to the bottom and they look at the summary, like, what are the recommendations? That's what I'll do. I don't need to see all this stuff in the middle. And I just thought, why don't we just teach patients how to do their own biopsychosocial? And when you think about a biopsychosocial, I want you to think about it as a fingerprint. We all have our unique fingerprints. No two fingerprints are identical. Just like we all have our unique biopsychosocial. No two are identical, right? Because there's only one you. So when you do draw up this biopsychosocial, draw 3 circles that are overlapping. It's like a Venn diagram. Biologically, where are you losing your joy from like a biological perspective, a medical perspective? So I use myself as an example. I have a low thyroid. So if I don't take care of my thyroid hormone, I'm not going to be the happiest person. I'm going to be losing joy there. I'll be sluggish, irritable, have physical symptoms. But someone else may have, let's say, an autoimmune condition where they're constantly in a state of inflammation or chronic pain, where your body's in such stress that it's hard to engage in moments, right? And then some of us are going through perimenopause and menopause where those hormonal fluctuations make it very difficult or challenging to access joy. But there are a ton of other biological things. Psychologically, what are our past painful experiences, like our past traumas? What were our attachment styles like? Did we have secure attachments? Were we raised in very hostile environments or neglectful environments? Are we anxiously attached or avoidant attached? Uh, Also, what are our coping mechanisms? What are our psychiatric conditions? Some of us have ADHD, PTSD. Uh, and then socially, what's happening in our day-to-day lives, right? So I talked about psychologically how I had scarcity trauma, but socially, you know, at the time in 2020 when I was at my most anhedonic period, I was under a lot of pressure at work. We have this lab in Manhattan where we do uh, FDA regulated studies, and we had to keep doing these studies in the middle of a pandemic. It was very stressful bringing people in during a pandemic, being worried about getting staff sick. And it's just like a very, very, very stressful time. And also socially, my habits weren't the greatest. I wasn't getting a lot of sleep. I wasn't eating the best foods. I was not really getting a lot of movement. So my daily habits weren't great. I didn't have a lot of access to nature during a time when I would normally have taken trips and gone to the beach or, hiking and stuff like that. I wasn't getting a lot of that. So socially, what's happening? For some of us, socially, it's our relationships. We're not in the best relationships. Maybe we engage in too much drinking or smoking and so forth. So, those are areas in terms of what we're doing day to day. Where are we losing our joy? And another social component, a lot of folks, especially younger folks, are neglecting, and it's not really coming up, in terms of like their own reflection is like, how much time are they spending on screens? We can lose a lot of our points of joy if we're not living in the real world and we're constantly on a screen. So the biopsychosocial, it sounds complex, but it really isn't. It's really a nice way of us to validate where we're losing our joy, and then strategically, you know, figure out ways to add that joy back. And I think for my patients, it gives them hope because we often think of like happiness as being linear, like if I do this one thing, it'll help me. But when you use a biopsychosocial model, you see that there are different ways to get points of joy for different avenues. So it's way more hopeful.
Beautiful, beautiful. What do you think about adding a fourth? So, biopsychosocial spiritual. And I'm asking because, we live at a time where a lot of people have the belief that it's all sort of random chance. Nothing actually matters. We're on this sort of floating rock in the middle of a empty universe. Like it's all sort of meaningless anyway. And for me, a massive part of psychological health is sort of a connection to something bigger than yourself. So I was just curious to get your thoughts on how important that is, given the work that you do.
Well, so spirituality is actually within that biopsychosocial model. So when you think about spirituality, the foremost, at least in the United States and in New York City, the person who studies that the most is Dr. Lisa Miller. She's at Columbia, and she's developed the spirituality scales that are essentially the blueprint for spirituality and mental health research. We're actually doing a spirituality study in our happiness lab here, looking at Gen Z and spirituality because there's something called the World Happiness Report, and it's a report that gets put out every year, and it looks at trends in happiness. And traditionally, according to the World Happiness Report, there's a U shape in happiness. So at the tip of the U, there's young people, and then as you go to midlife, people's happiness goes down, and then as they become elders, their happiness goes up. So like it's usually U shape. But what they're finding now for the past couple of years, 5 years, is that younger generation, they're actually reporting lower levels of happiness. So, yeah, they used to be a protected generation, but they're not. They're becoming unhappier. And so we decided we wanted to look at whether or not spirituality played a role in that. And so when scientists like Dr. Lisa Miller study spirituality, what they're measuring are things like your connectedness to people, your engagement in nature, like that sense of awe, your sense of purpose, right? It's not just what people think often that spirituality is religion and faith based. It's not just that. It's a whole slew of things. And so we're looking at Gen Z, not children Gen Z, because Gen Z encapsulates teenagers and young adults. We're only studying the adults for, a lot of logistical reasons, ethical reasons, but we're looking at whether or not these young folks are happier being more spiritual versus being more religious, right? So when you think of religion, religion is like more of a doctrine, like you're following a set of rules, you're part of a more ritualistic uh, group, and there's like a lot of right versus wrong within religion versus spirituality has all of these experiences being connected, the acts of kindness, being you know, present in nature, feeling purposeful and meaningful, all these things. And religion may play a part in there, but it's a bit more nuanced. So we're trying to see, and the study is relatively new, but we're trying to see uh, whether or not those who are identified as being more spiritual or who actually engage in more spirituality versus religion end up reporting more happiness. So I think you know, it'll be interesting to see. And it just so happened to coincide during a time where there's so much religious polarization, and that wasn't we wrote this protocol before that. So it was just pure luck on our end that we were actually doing this, and it coincided at this time where there's just so much of a conversation and a dialogue over spirituality and religion within this particular population.
No, I've spoken with Lisa before. It was one of my favorite interviews I've ever done on the podcast. Incredible, incredible woman. Something I heard you say just there about connection. This is maybe the essence of spirituality. That really rings true. But something I've heard you say that really surprised me was this idea that, and maybe I'm getting this wrong, but it was something to do with when you look at a depressed brain, you really do see a lack of connection or deficiencies in connection, even at that level. And I'm like, oh my God, like it's connection all the way down, and all the way up.
Yeah, when I was in training not too long ago, and it's a little shocking, right, that we've changed our science has gotten so much better, but I think it's because technology has really advanced. We used to look at the brain, like, kind of like how this model brain is, like, sectioned off, right? It's sectioned off with colors because, we just to see different parts of the brain, like the lobes and different figures that are important. But when I was taught about the brain in medical school and in training, it was like, okay, there's a certain part that does depression, and there's a certain part that does thinking, and there's a certain part that's memory, and a certain part that does that's for anxiety and for movement. But now it's so nuanced. It's more about like rather than thinking about the brain as being sectioned, we need to be thinking about the brain as being connected. And that when a brain that's highly traumatized or a brain that no longer accesses joy. When a brain is in those type of states for too long, what you actually see on a micro level or a tiny level when you zoom in is that the brain cells are not as connected. So we're looking at how they're able to branch out, and then we're looking at when you light the brain up with certain dyes and radiology, whether or not you see movement or like communication. And these brains that have been stressed out or have been depressed or have been under a lot of heavy substances, there's no longer that connection, right? And that's why things like, psychedelics are so fascinating. We do psychedelic studies in our lab. We opened a psychedelic unit a year ago, and the theory behind the psychedelics is that it allows your brain to connect more, to access areas that maybe were not getting accessed because you were in a default stuck pattern. Uh, and also, even practices like meditation and mindfulness. When scientists look at um, people who meditate and for hours and so forth, and they've just gotten so good at being present and accessing parts of their brain that allow them to feel calm and satiated, that looks like a healed brain that's more connected. And so, you don't necessarily have to go on a psychedelic trip to get the benefits of connection. If you engage in just being present and being intentional about these acts of joy that give your life meaning and purpose, you're getting a little bit of that every day. So you don't have to necessarily, um, go to a place to engage in a trip to get the benefits of having a more connected brain. Even things like managing your stress better can help you to heal that brain. Stress is like one of the biggest things that people struggle with and they just ignore. Stress impacts your sleep, getting more sleep, eating foods that um, are supportive of the building blocks in your brain, eating foods that are rich in nutrients and minerals that allow those neurons, those brain cells to feel happier. Omega-3 fatty acids, the fish and walnuts and things that have those fatty acids in it allow the brain to communicate better. So there are all these little steps, right? Those little things that you can do that to bring that back, those points of joy. But we often just want the big thing to happen, but we're ignoring the little things that we can be doing to live a happier and more joyful life.
For sure. It makes me wonder, and again, just wild speculation, but like when you think of some like quite severe mental health conditions, like something like bipolar, someone that goes through extreme trauma and then has dissociation and things after, that's really a lack of connection between brain areas as well whenever that's something like that is happening. So I've never thought about it through that lens before. So super interesting to think about. I wanted to ask you, Dr. Judith, about some of the more interesting things you've discovered in your research, and I love this thing, autoscopic phenomenon. Can you tell us about this and why this is so important to understand?
Well, during the after 2020, a lot of workplaces were experiencing, this the anhedonia, and they were saying they were burnt out and can a mental health professional come in and help revamp them. And one of the things that I found while discussing, the experience of these workers with them was that they were just so tired of being on screens. And yeah, it was necessary. We needed to not be in person, right? But they were saying that like there was something that was really draining them. And it was validating for them to hear about something called Zoom fatigue, which is studied at Stanford extensively. And that's a university in California where people being on screen meetings all day long was literally causing like a digital depression, right? And what they found was that you were on your screens and you were feeling more stressed because you were performing more. It's when you think about it, when you're in person around a table and you're meeting with people, you're not thinking, oh, everyone's looking at me the whole time because a table has someone to your left, to your right, across the room from you. So there's less pressure for you to be performing at all times, right? So people were more stressed. And what they found was that people were scrutinizing themselves more. So when we were designed, when we were made, our brains were really designed to look at other people and not ourselves, right? Like it's not natural for you to see your face next to the person that you're talking to. Because what that does is that you start to scrutinize the way you look. You're not as present and engaged in that conversation with that individual. And, we're supposed to look at each other and say, oh, like, does that person like me? Are they safe? Like, what do they think of me? Are they offended by what I'm saying? Do they like what I'm saying? That's how we're designed. We're supposed to look at each other and communicate, not look at ourselves. But what we're doing is we're spending a lot of times looking at ourselves. And that's making us stress, it's making us self scrutinize. It's literally taking out the point of joy of connection. And so this Stanford Zoom Center has these very clear recommendations like don't look at yourself, like minimize the amount of time on the screen. What they also found was that when we're on screens, we're not moving as much. Like we take granted even little movements, even like the shifting in a chair to look at someone and using our hands and gesturing. All of those things get lost because we're just planted in front of a screen. So they actually recommend, just doing audio calls, even like taking a walk during a meeting, using standing desks because we're not getting the movement that naturally brings us the endorphins that we would get if we were not planted and fixed in front of a screen. And there was a really interesting study done earlier this year at one of the University of Texas schools where and this wasn't about Zoom or laptop meetings, but this was about phones, where they took away the smartphone feature from these adults, and you couldn't go online, you couldn't go on social media, you can only use your phone for calling or text. And what they found was that after about a month, the joy scores, the happiness scores shot up as if these people were like on an antidepressant. And when they asked people, like, what were you doing instead of being on your phone? People were getting better sleep, right? Because you weren't doom scrolling at night and you weren't messing up your natural melatonin by looking at these screens with the light. People were had being more social. They were talking to each other more, literally engaging in their connections more. They were spending more time in nature, right? That sense of awe. They were getting more movement. So they were getting all those points that we measure in the research. And when I say the points that we measure in the research, it's because in research, when we literally are looking to see if someone's becoming happier, we'll ask them things like, when you ate your food, did you savor it? Was it yep? Yep. Okay, that's a point. When you took a nap, did you wake up feeling refreshed? Okay, that's a point, right? When you were lonely, and you reach out to a friend, did you feel connected, seen, and heard? That was a point. Those are all the points that we add up to see if someone's becoming happier, right? So these people are getting more of these points. But in the real world, when people, let's say they come to my private practice, my therapy practice, when they come to me and they say, Dr. Judith, I just want to be happy. Well, I ask them, well, what does that mean to you? And they'll say, oh, it's when I finally had that big job, or I finally have the love of my life, or I finally have a family. It's always something external that has to happen to feel happy. But they're missing out on the points of joy that we actually measure in the research. So it's a full reframe. Like, instead of holding your breath for something external to happen, try and cultivate the internal points of joy. Happiness is external. It's dependent on something else happening. Joy is internal. It's our birthright. It's built into our DNA. So try and cultivate that and be intentional about that, because that's the experience that we're hoping people get in order to feel happier in the world.
So important. With the autoscopic phenomenon, I've actually applied this for the first time in this conversation, and it's been really enjoyable, more enjoyable than usual. Obviously, I'm speaking to yourself as well, but like I have on my screen, I have blocked out I can't see myself. I just have a sticky note, and it just all it says on it is bring out the best, and it's to bring out the best in you. And there's no focus on me at all, and it's making the experience so much easier than it would be if I could see myself there. So there's definitely something to that. Um, you have a framework, a 5 V's framework. We're not going to have time to cover it all. We have about 10 minutes left. But you've got validate, event, values, vitals, and vision. Can you maybe just give us sort of like a taste of this? Maybe validate. I've heard that's the hardest part. Can you tell me a little bit of why this is so hard and what this involves?
Yeah, well, the going back to the autoscopic phenomenon, that's actually something that we notice in schizophrenia patients. It's when the autoscopic phenomena is it's kind of like a hallucination. When a patient walks into a room, they see themselves across the room, and it freaks them out, and they get anxious, and that's like a visual hallucination. But I apply it to what we're doing on screens is because we are literally exposing ourselves to the picture of ourselves nonstop, and it's unnatural. We're not supposed to be looking at ourselves that much. So it's creating this false autoscopic phenomenon within ourselves. But the 5 V's is, when I've traveled the world looking at happiness, and I noticed the number 5 coming up a lot across the globe. And I thought, why is that the case? And I think it's because most of us have 5 fingers, and that's why. But I wanted people to imagine their hand, right? And to say, I'm built with a DNA for joy. Let me tap into one of these 5 V's every day to at least get 1 or 2 points of joy, 1 or 2, no more than that. And the first V is validation. Validation is acknowledging and accepting how you feel and what you're going through without judgment. And it's very difficult for those of us who are accustomed to pushing down our emotions and pushing down our pain. That's our coping skill. We don't want to deal with it, so we avoid it. But if we don't learn how to process it, then it's hard to actually access the joy. We push down the ability to feel the joy. And I often say that validation is like, imagine you're in a really dark room, you can't see anything, and you hear a loud crash. Some of us start screaming, some of us start running, some would start swinging. But if you turn the light on and you saw, that was just like a vase that fell. I'm safe. That decreases the uncertainty. So you feel more calm. There's more clarity. And so validation is acknowledging and accepting what you feel no matter what. If you're feeling worried, acknowledge that. A lot of my patients come in, they say, I'm so angry. But when we turn the light on, we actually see it's not anger. You may have like snapped at someone, you may have been irritable, but the actual feeling was fear. You were worried. So let's name it appropriately and acknowledge it. That's validation.
Can I just ask something here? Like, what do you think the link here is with attachment? So, like, say early in life, a child has a maybe an insecure attachment relationship with their caregiver, where they might cry, and then the caregiver doesn't validate the emotion, doesn't tend to the child. So the child then learns that my emotions are invalid and I should ignore them. So I should ignore my impulses, my bodily whatever. So if you're able to actually consciously practice validating your emotions, you're sort of becoming like your own parent. You're sort of becoming like your inner parent, and you're meeting those needs in the present.
Yeah. You're parenting your inner child and you're acknowledging what happened to that inner child rather than dismissing it. And what happens is that if you many times when you are raised that way to invalidate your emotions because your parents, people who are supposed to love and protect you the most, are invalidating, what you end up doing because you've learned that, you not only invalidate yourself, you start to invalidate the emotions of those around you. So, what I found in my practice is that when people start to acknowledge and accept how they feel, they not only start to validate themselves, they start to validate others. And validation is so powerful. It is an act of love, not just for yourself, but for those around you. The second V is venting. Venting is expressing how you feel in an authentic and intentional way. And when people come to my lab, I'll do this experiment where they take a red balloon and they try to push that red balloon into a tank of water and try to submerge it. And 100% of the time, that balloon pops up. Why? Because you cannot out math physics, you know? And I do this because then I ask people to deflate the balloon, and then they all deflate it and they are able to push it easily into the water without resistance. And I do this because I want people to see that when you learn how to express how you feel over time, you have more control. Because if you don't, those feelings will pop up in your health, like that balloon pops up through the water and makes a splash. It'll pop up in your relationships, pop up at work in ways that you can't control it. And venting can be verbally, right? Like you can talk to a therapist if you have one. But if you don't have a therapist, pick one or two people where there's reciprocity, where there's an understanding that I go to you, you come to me. It's not gossiping, it's not trauma dumping. You're going to ask for emotional consent. You're going to say, is this a good time to talk? And can we try to come up with a resolution, right? You want to vent with intention, but venting could be done non-verbally through writing in a journal. It could be done through prayer. If you're a spiritually based person, it can be done through expression, through art. Vent in a way that feels authentic to you. And the third V is values. Values are things I say are, they're the things that are priceless, not with price tags. So values are things that, imagine you have 5 minutes left on this earth at the end of your life. What would you be doing? Many times we think our values are the things with the price tags. Most people won't say, like, I wish I had a Porsche, right? They'd say, I wish I had 5 minutes to be with my loved ones or to give to a cause I believed in, or to be in nature, to see that sunset in that beautiful place that I saw like 10 years ago. So really understand what your true values are, not the things with the price tags, the things that are priceless, and try to tap into those. The fourth V is vitals. Vitals are what can you do to support your body and brain because you only get one. And there are traditional vitals like getting sleep, proper food, nutrition that's healthy, getting good movement. But the three non-traditional vitals are things like our digital exposure. We talked about that a lot, you know, our relationships with other people, because it's a huge predictor of our longevity, and our work-life balance. Those are the three non-traditional ones that your doctor doesn't bring up because they don't have time, but that's important for your body and brain. And the fifth V, my favorite V, is vision. How do you plan joy in the future so you don't get stuck in the past? How do you celebrate your wins? Like, don't neglect those small points. And for me, my small point of joy is every day after I take my daughter to school, I sit in my living room and I just drink this delicious coffee that I got in the Caribbean one year, and that's my me time, and I look forward to it every day. But for others, it could be something else. Carve out those small wins so you keep moving forward instead of getting stuck in the past.
Amazing, amazing. Right. We've time for maybe one more question. I know you've got to get going on the hour. Is there anything that I haven't asked you during this interview that you think would be really important to share with people before we wrap up?
Well, I think, sometimes we don't realize how anhedonia is possibly contagious. Like I talked about how in my most anhedonic period, I was very busy in my lab. And when I reflect now and I think about what people around me were like, I remember my daughter being very stressed. I remember my teammates being very stressed. There was not a lot of joy, at home and at work. So when you think about it, we want to prioritize joy. And it's not something that's just like nice to have. It's it's not something that's a luxury, it's an essential, right? And in my work, what I found is that joy is so important because people who are joyful have better physical health, they have better relationships, they're more likely to give to their communities. We used to think that it's angry, bitter people that go out and change the world. No, joyful people want to go out and make the world a better place. They're better, they're better workers, like they have better careers. Everything's better when you're full of joy. So in the way that a lack of joy is, I think, contagious, joy is contagious too. I truly believe that if our leaders were more joyful, they wouldn't be out for the next mega yacht. They wouldn't be out to like try to take over another country. They'd be like, let's make the world a better place. But we neglect joy. We treat it like it's like a nice thing to have, like a luxury, but I think it's essential and I think it's healing.
I love that. I love that. What a great note to end on. Where can people get the book? Where can they learn more about your work online, Dr. Judith?
Well, you can find my book everywhere books are sold. It's now in over 20 countries and over 17 languages. And it's called High Functioning, um, Understand Your Hidden Depression and Reclaim Your Joy. And you can buy it in the UK, I think at Waterstones, the US, anywhere, anywhere. But you can go to the website and drjoseph.com and get an audio book as well. It's an audio and ebook. It was just named the top 10 Audible Wellbeing Book of the Year. And I just found out that it was in the top 8% of shared audiobooks on Spotify. So, um, so excited about that. Who knew that people want to learn about hidden depression, but I think they're more interested in reclaiming their joy.
For sure, for sure. Okay. Thank you, Dr. Judith.
Thank you. It's so nice to meet you. Thanks for having me.
If you enjoyed this episode, you might also enjoy getting our 7 Insights newsletter. This is a once per month email where I share 7 of the most valuable insights I've uncovered in the previous 30 days. It includes book, podcast, and documentary recommendations, as well as questions and quotes specifically curated to help you live a more creative, intentional, and meaningful life. It currently goes out to over 50,000 subscribers each month. And if you're interested in joining them, you can sign up via the link in the description.